There is a substance sitting in your kitchen right now that was once worth more than gold. Wars were fought over it. Empires were built on it. Entire civilizations collapsed without it. The word salary comes from it. The word soldier may come from it. Even the phrase worth his salt comes from it. For most of human history, this white crystal was the most valuable commodity on Earth. More precious than silver, more strategic than oil, more fought over than any territory. And today, you can buy a kilogram of it for almost nothing. This is the story of salt, the mineral that built civilization, toppled empires, sparked revolutions, and became so cheap we barely notice it exists. Let's get into it. Before we get into the history, we need to understand why salt matters so much. Because the answer is written into our biology. The human body is approximately 0.4% salt by weight. Your blood, your tears, your sweat, all of them are saline solutions. Every nerve impulse in your body, every muscle contraction, every heartbeat depends on the precise balance of sodium ions in your cells. Without salt, your nervous system shuts down, your heart stops, you die. Your body cannot produce salt on its own. It must come from outside. And your brain, knowing this, has evolved to make salt taste intensely pleasurable. The craving for salt is one of the oldest and most hardwired drives in human neurology. It is not a preference, it is a biological imperative. For early hunter-gatherer humans, this wasn't a problem. The meat they ate contained enough natural sodium to survive. But the moment humans settled down and switched to farming, eating mostly grains, vegetables, and cooked food, they lost their primary dietary salt source almost overnight. Suddenly, salt had to be found, mined, traded, and preserved. And whoever controlled the salt supply controlled something more fundamental than land or gold. They controlled the basic biological survival of entire populations. That is why salt became the foundation of every ancient economy. Not because people liked the taste, because without it, they would literally die. Archaeological evidence suggests humans were deliberately harvesting salt as far back as 8,000 years ago. One of the oldest known salt works in the world was discovered at Lunca in Romania, where Stone Age people were boiling spring water in ceramic pots to extract salt crystals over 6,000 years ago. The site shows evidence of industrial-scale salt production for its era, suggesting that even in prehistoric times, salt was being produced not just for personal use, but for trade. In China, salt production along the shores of Lake Yuncheng in Shaanxi province dates back at least 6,000 years. Ancient Chinese texts describe salt as one of the fundamental necessities of civilization, alongside grain, silk, and iron. The Chinese government recognized the strategic importance of salt so early that it established the world's first state salt monopoly during the Zhou dynasty around 600 BC. A system of government control over salt production and distribution that would be copied by virtually every empire that followed. In Egypt, salt played a central role in one of the most important rituals of ancient civilization: mummification. The Egyptians used a naturally occurring salt called natron to preserve bodies for the afterlife. Without salt, the entire Egyptian religion's promise of resurrection would have been physically impossible. Salt wasn't just food, it was the bridge between life and death. In Mesopotamia, salt was so important that contracts were sealed by sharing salt, a tradition that survives today in the phrase bread and salt hospitality across the Middle East and Eastern Europe. Breaking a salt covenant was considered one of the most serious betrayals possible. No civilization understood the strategic importance of salt better than Rome. The Romans built one of their earliest and most important roads, the Via Salaria, literally salt road, specifically to transport salt from the salt pans at the mouth of the Tiber River into the interior of Italy. This road, built around 500 BC, predates most of Rome's famous military roads and reveals something important. Salt logistics came before military logistics. Roman soldiers were famously paid partly in salt, or in money specifically allocated for buying salt. This payment was called a salarium, the direct root of the English word salary. When we talk about earning a salary today, we are linguistically connected to Roman soldiers being paid in salt more than 2,000 years ago. The Romans used salt for everything. Garum, the fermented fish sauce that was the ketchup of the Roman world, present in virtually every Roman dish, was produced through heavy salting of fish entrails. Roman soldiers carried salt rations. Salt was used to preserve olives, cheese, and meat. The Roman legions that conquered the known world were sustained, in a very literal sense, by salt logistics. When Rome wanted to punish a conquered enemy utterly and completely, they didn't just burn their city. There's a famous historical claim, somewhat debated by modern scholars, that Rome salted the earth of Carthage after its destruction in 146 BC, making the land permanently infertile. Whether literally true or not, the symbolism was understood by everyone. To destroy a civilization completely, you attacked its relationship with salt. Salt and Rome were so intertwined that the city of Salzburg in Austria, one of Europe's most beautiful cities, literally means salt fortress in German. It was built to control Alpine salt trade routes. In medieval Europe, salt was the foundation of the entire food economy, for one simple reason. There were no refrigerators. There was no canning. There was no way to preserve food over winter except one: salt. Salted fish, salted meat, salted butter, salted cheese. These were the difference between surviving winter and starving to death. For the vast majority of medieval Europeans, the ability to salt and preserve food in summer was what kept them alive until spring. This gave salt an almost unimaginable economic importance. The medieval herring trade, perhaps the most important food trade in Northern Europe, was entirely dependent on salt. The Dutch and Hanseatic merchants who controlled the North Sea herring fisheries and the Baltic salt supplies became some of the wealthiest people in the medieval world. The Hanseatic League, the great medieval trading confederation of Northern European cities, was built substantially on the salt-preserved fish trade. The city of Venice rose to become one of the most powerful states in the medieval world, partly through its control of salt production in the Adriatic. Venice's salt monopoly funded its navy, its art, and its extraordinary political independence. The Doge of Venice managed salt supplies with the same care that modern governments manage oil reserves. Meanwhile, in West Africa, one of the most extraordinary economic phenomena in world history was unfolding. The great empires of Mali and Songhai were sitting on vast gold deposits, but they desperately needed salt, which was scarce in the interior of the continent. North African traders had salt, but wanted gold. The result was one of history's most remarkable trade relationships: gold for salt, pound for pound. By weight, equal value. The salt caravans crossing the Sahara were among the most valuable commercial enterprises on Earth. The city of Timbuktu grew wealthy as the meeting point of these two commodities: gold from the south, salt from the north. The idea that salt was literally worth its weight in gold wasn't a metaphor in medieval West Africa. It was a market price. Governments throughout history understood something fundamental. If you control salt, you control everything. Because everyone needs salt. Every day. Without exception. A tax on salt is impossible to avoid. It falls equally on rich and poor, but devastatingly unequally in terms of what percentage of their income it represents. The most infamous salt tax in history was the French gabelle, a royal tax on salt that existed in various forms from the 13th century until the French Revolution. The gabelle was not just a tax, it was a system of extraordinary cruelty. Every French person above the age of 8 was legally required to purchase a minimum amount of salt per year from government-controlled sellers at a government-controlled price. You couldn't use less. You couldn't buy from another source. You couldn't produce your own. The price of taxed salt varied wildly across different regions of France. In some areas, it was 20 times more expensive than in others, purely based on which tax jurisdiction you were in. Smuggling salt was a capital crime. Thousands of people were imprisoned, sent to the galleys, or executed for salt smuggling every year. By the late 18th century, the gabelle consumed approximately 50% of a poor family's food budget. It was one of the most hated institutions in France. When the French Revolution came in 1789, abolishing the gabelle was one of the first acts of the new government, greeted with jubilation across the country. The salt tax hadn't caused the revolution on its own, but it had been grinding the faces of the French poor for 500 years. And when the breaking point came, salt was right there at the centre of it. Britain's relationship with salt is a story of both industrial triumph and colonial exploitation. In Cheshire, England, sits one of the largest and most accessible salt deposits in the world. Vast underground seams of rock salt that the Romans had first mined and the British industrialised on a massive scale in the 18th and 19th centuries. By 1800, Cheshire was producing hundreds of thousands of tons of salt per year, supplying not just Britain, but its entire global empire. And that empire found ways to weaponise salt that would have impressed even the Romans. In India, the British East India Company established a complete monopoly on salt production and distribution, one of the most profitable and despised monopolies in colonial history. Indians were forbidden from producing their own salt, even from the sea that surrounded their own coastline. They were forced to buy British-produced salt at prices that extracted enormous wealth from some of the poorest people on Earth. The salt tax represented approximately 8.2% of British India's total tax revenue, paid overwhelmingly by the rural poor, for whom it represented a crushing burden. This colonial salt policy became the target of one of the most brilliant acts of political resistance in history. On March 12, 1930, Mahatma Gandhi began his Salt March, a 240-mile walk to the coastal town of Dandi to pick up salt from the sea in direct defiance of British law. It was a masterstroke. Salt was something every Indian understood, every Indian used, and every Indian resented paying taxes on. By framing Indian independence as a salt issue, Gandhi made it personal for every single person in the country, regardless of education, class, or politics. When Gandhi reached the sea and picked up a handful of salt on April 6, 1930, he broke British law in front of the world's press. The British response, arresting over 60,000 people for following his example, shocked the international community and turned global opinion against British colonial rule. The Salt March didn't end British rule immediately, but it cracked the moral authority of the empire in a way that never healed. And it was a handful of salt that did it.
In America, salt played a role in the Civil War that most history books barely mention, but which significantly affected the outcome. The Confederate South had a critical salt problem. Salt was essential for preserving food, particularly pork, which was the primary meat of the Confederate Army and civilian population. But the South had very limited salt production capacity compared to the North. The Union recognized this weakness and made destroying Confederate salt works a military priority. Union forces specifically targeted salt production facilities in Virginia, Florida, and Louisiana. The fall of Saltville, Virginia, the Confederacy's most important salt works, in late 1864, contributed directly to the food supply crisis that accelerated Confederate collapse. Historians have argued that the South's salt shortage was one of the underappreciated logistical factors in Confederate defeat. An army and a civilian population that couldn't properly preserve food couldn't sustain a war indefinitely. Meanwhile, in the North, the Erie Canal, completed in 1825, was partly built to transport salt from the enormous deposits in Onondaga County, New York, to markets across the eastern United States. New York State's salt production was so central to the early American economy that a salt barrel was included on the state's original seal. After the Civil War, as refrigeration technology developed and food preservation became less dependent on salt, its economic importance began its long decline. But by then, salt had already done its work, shaping the geography, economy, and politics of a nation. In the 19th century, something extraordinary happened to salt. Chemists discovered that it was far more than a food preservative. Sodium chloride, table salt, turns out to be one of the most chemically useful substances on Earth. Through a process called electrolysis, salt water can be split into chlorine gas, sodium hydroxide, and hydrogen, three of the most important industrial chemicals in the world. Chlorine from salt became the basis of water purification, the technology that eliminated cholera, typhoid, and dozens of other waterborne diseases from cities worldwide. More lives have probably been saved by chlorinating water supplies with salt-derived chlorine than by any other public health measure in history. Sodium hydroxide from salt became the basis for paper production, textile manufacturing, and soap making. Chlorine became the basis for PVC plastic, pharmaceutical manufacturing, and the pesticides that enabled the Green Revolution. The same substance that Julius Caesar's soldiers were paid in, the same crystal that Gandhi marched 240 miles to pick up from a beach, turned out to be the chemical foundation of the modern industrial world. Salt didn't just preserve food, it preserved civilization, and then helped build an entirely new one. Today, salt has completed one of the most dramatic reversals in the history of any commodity. The substance that was once worth its weight in gold, that toppled empires and sparked revolutions, now costs almost nothing. A kilogram of table salt in most countries costs less than a cup of coffee. Modern industrial salt production is staggeringly efficient. The world produces approximately 300 million tons of salt per year, enough to fill the Great Pyramid of Giza over 100 times annually. The United States alone produces around 40 million tons per year, and yet we have a new salt crisis, almost the exact opposite of every previous one. For most of human history, people struggled to get enough salt. Today, in wealthy countries, the problem is that people consume far too much of it. The processed food industry, facing the same economic pressures as the sugar industry, discovered that salt, like sugar, makes food more palatable, extends shelf life, and drives overconsumption. The same industry that hid sugar in 74% of packaged foods also hid salt in extraordinary quantities in everything from breakfast cereals to bread to canned vegetables. The average American consumes approximately 3,400 milligrams of sodium per day, more than double the amount recommended by health authorities. The World Health Organization estimates that excess salt consumption causes approximately 1.89 million deaths per year globally through hypertension, stroke, and heart disease. The mineral that people once went to war over to get enough of is now quietly killing millions through excess. History has a sense of irony. Salt's story is 8,000 years long. It built the roads of Rome. It funded the cathedrals of Venice. It broke the back of the French poor and sparked a revolution. It helped end British colonialism with a handful of crystals on a beach. It is written into our language: salary, soldier, salad, sauce. It is written into our religion: the salt covenant, the salt of the earth. It is written into our biology. The saline tears on your face right now contain the same salt that ancient humans fought and died for. We stopped noticing salt the moment it became cheap. But cheap doesn't mean unimportant. It just means we forgot the price that was paid to get here.
If this video made you look at your salt shaker differently, that's exactly what we were going for. Hit like, subscribe, and let us know in the comments, what should Facts and Stories cover next? See you in the next one.